Hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about one of Beethoven's most loved sonatas for piano, the Pathetique Sonata, Opus 13 in C minor. As you know, Beethoven loved the key of C minor. He wrote his Fifth Symphony in C minor. He wrote his Third Piano Concerto in C minor. He wrote a string quartet, a violin sonata, and two other piano sonatas, and a good deal of other music. And he always turned to that key when he wanted to express drama, intensity, seriousness, and this sonata, Opus 13, is no exception. Though he was only 27 when he wrote it and still had 30 years of life to go, he had certainly found his very distinctive voice by the time he wrote this piece. It begins with a slow section. I'm not calling it an introduction yet because I want to bring up the question of whether it truly is an introduction or whether it in fact is an integral part of the first movement. It starts with a very close position bass chord, and it is possible to imitate what brass players and string players can do so well, and that is have a forte piano on one chord. And you can do it by just releasing slightly the hands from the keyboard while quickly damping the pedal partly, cutting some of the sound, and then retaking the pedal. So that's an extreme. You can experiment with it. It's very effective once you get the hang of it. The rhythm of this, perhaps inspired by Bach's Partita in C minor, the dotted rhythm of this opening section of the Pathetique Sonata, I think needs very strict feeling of tempo. In fact, when I play it, I even think in my head, as if 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, dividing the beat into those subdivisions of 4, but thinking of the 4 as slightly late. So not double dotted, but slightly late, so it has a little bit of urgency. Ba, 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 ba. So it sounds silence. Silence. I'm emphasizing the importance of silence because in this piece there are a number of places where it's extremely important. And at the beginning is certainly one of them, where you should not cut the silence short. I would also urge, from a performance standpoint, not to make accents on the or a crescendo to it. Just a slight shaping is quite sufficient. The drama is heightened when the dynamics are kept more contained, with just the forte piano as a bold gesture and then a kind of inward quality. Now finally, sforzando, and again sforzando. Now the same rhythm, but instead of being dark and brooding, it's tender and poignant. Partly it's the octave doubling, and partly it's the turn to the major, E flat major, the relative major. Performance tip: when the fortissimo comes immediately following that tenderness, don't bang, don't play too loud. I've heard it so many times when it just provokes cringe. So so very poignant. Resist the desire to make a crescendo until here. And then you can hold back a little bit. Silence. And then the allegro begins. Another word of advice about this is to, well, actually, what I want to point out about the melodic shape of this opening is this rising three notes, because it's going to become important later in the piece. Now in the allegro, which then follows this opening section, again it's built on rising line. But Beethoven kind of perversely asks you not to make a crescendo for that rising line, and instead to make a crescendo as the line descends. So keep it very, very steady. Clarity is always more important than speed. So don't let it be running. You want to hear this pulsation. And the clarity of those small notes is absolutely essential, and it's much more important than sheer speed. Then you have a series of sequences, followed by, and then, which brings you to the second theme, and an important technical issue for this brief transition. I've seen many people quite naturally lift the left hand over. Now what do? You've got to play down there. Are you going to crawl under and be stuck? Or are you going to go to the right in order to go to the left? It's all very cumbersome and awkward. The solution is to bring in the left hand under the right so that you can move immediately to this low register and then be free to travel without going under this big left hand arm, which will be in your way. So. Okay, so that should solve that problem. Now the second theme is actually made of that rising third that I wanted to point out. So now we have probably it's a good idea to play the sforzando notes with the third finger. And quite a bit of wrist motion. So that you can give them a good jab. And try, again, not to be too fast, but to be very steady. This happens several times. Ba 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 ba. And then finally in major. I like changing the quality and character a little bit for that, because this is quite insistent and a little bit angry sounding. And finally, maybe a little less intense, the sforzando. And that continues. Hold back a little. I recommend pedaling those two measures and feeling like it's ready to pounce, but it's like holding back. And then it goes. Again, a little slow, as if you're like a crouching tiger, ready to leap, but holding it up. And again, so the 4 pedaled measures and then no pedal. So, then we have closing material. And first ending. Surprise. You expected me to go back to the allegro after the first ending, as is so often the case. And most performances do that because most editions print the repeat sign at the beginning of the allegro. Well, not to go into too much detail, but there is a dispute in the scholarly community about whether that repeat sign from the allegro was put in by Beethoven, because apparently in the manuscript it is in a different pencil or a different pen and looks different from the rest of the manuscript. It's possible that the publisher received it without any repeat sign at the allegro and thought that Beethoven may have left it out. So some modern performances in the 20th century, like Rudolf Serkins and Andras Schiff's in our own time, actually go back and repeat the opening section, the grave section. It seems to make sense because the next time you come to that same place, second ending. So the grave opening material comes back. So it seems to make sense that it might be intended for it to return as part of the repeated exposition, that it is in fact the beginning of the exposition, not merely an introduction to it. All right, in this return now, beginning of development section, we have the opening material. Sadly. Again, now the most wonderful moment, we have this diminished chord, which by one change of note in the left hand becomes the dominant 7th chord. So very quiet and a modulation. It's the dominant of E, and it turns out to be E minor. Again, we have the same. emphasizing three notes that has formed the basis for two of our main melodic ideas in the piece. And the resolving two-note phrase becomes a factor now in the next. He takes that downward resolving two-note phrase and so that's a further development of the opening material idea. And it's a very tricky subito piano in measure 163. No pedal, absolutely clear. Very light left hand. So this is the beginning of a transition now of 28 measures. He reaches G in measure 167, and that stays on. G, 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 G. Still, you can imagine that G as the basis of this little free cadenza. And finally we go to C from G. It's a very long dominant preparation, one of the longest in any sonata that I can think of. 28 measures of insistent G in the bass. And then even when it's not physically there in E, it's still implied by that harmony. So this brings us back to the beginning of the exposition and therefore the recapitulation. And we have everything that we had in the exposition with, of course, some variation until we come to the closing material. Chord, just as we had in the first ending and the second ending, what do we have? The grave material, the opening section material. After a long pause, 1 and 2. One and two. One final burst. Upward motion of the wrist gives you the most power. Don't ever play loud chords down because they'll be harsh. So with a little touch of pedal.